G'day everyone, Artist Wayne here and welcome back to my Ford GT40 Mk1 3D build. Now I've got to admit, when I first started this project, I wasn't entirely convinced that everything was going to fit together properly. Because between the cutting, the sanding, the filing, the painting and the occasional disaster, there were definitely moments where I was wondering what I'd gotten myself into. But now it's starting to look like a real car. It's got colour, it's got decals, it's got wheels, 2 wheels, but most importantly, it's actually starting to look like a real GT40. So in this episode, there's still plenty more to do, and I'm about to knock off a few more major milestones. Let's get into it. My Ford GT40 was no longer a collection of parts. It was becoming a car. Because there's always a point during a build where something changes. You stop looking at individual parts and start seeing the finished model. And I have to admit, that's exactly where I was right now. Because every day, another piece was falling into place. Another problem was getting solved, and another detail was being added. And with each little victory, the finish line was starting to come into view. Now this model certainly didn't come without its frustrations, and trust me, there were plenty of them. But I've always found that the most rewarding part of any build isn't necessarily the finished model, it's overcoming the challenges along the way. Because every now and then you come up against something that seems almost impossible, a problem you have absolutely no idea how you're going to solve. But then, through a bit of persistence, a bit of creativity, and sometimes a little bit of stubbornness, you figure it out. And honestly, there's nothing more rewarding than conquering a challenge that once seemed impossible. I was now determined to finally get one of the GT40's doors completed. Now thankfully the decals were no longer causing me any headaches. After all the trial and error from earlier, I finally had that process sorted. And seeing those Golf racing decals go on was becoming one of my favourite parts of the build. What I still wasn't completely sure about though was how I was going to make the door window glass. Because unlike a normal side window, the GT40 has a pretty intricate design. There's a window in the window with a cutout, different angles and plenty of opportunities to completely mess it up. So once again, it was time to put the thinking cap on and figure out another problem. Once all the decals were on the door, and I'd given everything a coat of clear gloss lacquer, it was finally time to tackle the window. Now these days, I save every piece of clear plastic packaging I can get my hands on purely for jobs like this. Because cutting out a basic car window, that's easy enough, but the GT40 doesn't have a basic window, it has a cutout built into it, and that was going to be a problem. My first window was ready, but my first mistake was to cut out the wrong size in a window. Then when I finally got the dimensions right, I traced around an old GoPro lens thinking that would solve the problem. Unfortunately, I couldn't cut the bloody thing cleanly to save my life. And because this window sits right in your face, it needed to be absolutely perfect. I even tried drilling the corners to create the rounded edges, but all that managed to do was melt the plastic, which looked absolutely terrible. So in the end, I went back to the basics, using a needle to carefully scribe the shapes I wanted, and amazingly, it worked an absolute treat. The finish was clean, the edges were neat, and for the first time, the door was finally starting to look exactly the way I'd imagined it. But before I could start gluing any of this together, there was still a couple of important pieces missing, because this GT40 door still needed proper door sills and a door handle. And unfortunately, those weren't parts I could just pull out of a box. So once again, it was back into 3D Studio Max to start designing them from scratch. And thankfully, by this stage of the build, I was getting a lot more confident with my 3D modelling, because every custom part I created was teaching me something new. And little details like the door sills and the handle might not seem like much on their own, but together they're what transforms a model into something that feels real. Once again, I was attacking this model on all fronts, because while I was adding the finishing touches to one area, I was already working on the next. This time I was designing the window clips in 3D Studio Max. Once I was happy with the design, it was straight onto the printer, which is one of the things I love about 3D printing. While you're working on one part of the build, the printer can be busy making another. And slowly but surely all those little jobs were starting to add up. Because on a build like this, it's often the smallest details that make the biggest difference. These clips would serve another purpose as well. They'd help create the illusion that the inner window could actually be opened. Now obviously this isn't a working window, but if I could make it look like one, then I'd done my job. And it's little details like this that really help trick the eye. Because when someone looks at the finished model, I don't want them to see a piece of plastic, I want them thinking that looks exactly like a real GT40 door. And with these window clips in place, the whole thing was starting to look remarkably convincing. Another milestone achieved, and I got to admit that felt pretty good, because this wasn't just another part completed, it was another major piece of the puzzle finally falling into place. And with that door finally finished, it was time to turn my attention to the other side. Because on a build like this, you don't really get to celebrate for too long. There's always another challenge waiting, another detail to add, and another box to tick. But with every milestone reached, the finish line was getting a little closer. I could finally start spending some time on the smaller details, which if I'm honest, is one of my favourite parts of any build. And this time I discovered that some scrap infill from an old print looked remarkably like a radiator grille. Now that's one of the things I love about 3D printing, because sometimes the leftovers are almost as useful as the actual parts. Because it's often these tiny little touches that nobody really notices individually, but together they make all the difference. And with the major bodywork finally starting to fall behind me, I could spend a little more time bringing this GT40 to life. Once again I was working on all fronts, and thankfully all that clear plastic packaging I'd been hoarding was finally paying dividends. At the same time, I was constantly checking and rechecking the fitment of the door before committing to glue. Because once this door was glued in place, there was no going back. I was also starting to psych myself up to tackle the GT40's windscreen, and that was going to be another challenge altogether. But before I got that far, I needed to reshape the rearview mirror using one of the parts from my Mad Max Interceptor files. I also had a plan for the windscreen wiper. Rather than model it from scratch, I was going to print two separate wipers and combine them into a single unit, just like the real GT40. And piece by piece, all these little details were coming together. Because at this stage of the build, it wasn't the big jobs that were moving the GT forward anymore, it was all the small ones. But now everything hinged on the windscreen, because unlike a lot of the other parts on this build, there was nowhere to hide with this one. If the windscreen didn't fit properly, I'd see it every single time I looked at the car, and that's why I was taking my time, measuring, checking, and then checking again. This wasn't just another part, it was the first thing people would notice. And if I was going to do justice to one of the most beautiful race cars ever built, then this windscreen needed to look perfect. This was the last major hurdle, because by this stage I knew how I was going to tackle everything else. The painting, the decals, the custom parts, the detailing. I'd already worked it all out. But the windscreen, that was the one thing I still wasn't completely sure about. So that's what made this such an important milestone. Because if I could solve this problem, then suddenly the finish line wouldn't just be coming into view, I'd be heading straight for it. The finish line was finally coming into view. While I worked through the countless little details, the last of the body panels were being painted and brought to life. Piece by piece, the iconic Golf colours were transforming this print into something truly special. I was now well on my way to completing this awesome Ford GT40 Mk1 in all its glorious racing livery. Well, my fellow 3D artists, that's it for episode 4. The finish line is finally in sight, and my mighty Ford GT40 Mk1 is just one episode away from being completed. I've had an absolute blast building this car, and I have learned quite a lot along the way. So join me for the grand finale, where I bring this racing legend across the line to take the checkered flag. I'm artist Wayne Dowsent, and I'll see you all in episode 5. Happy 3D printing, and thanks for watching, everyone.